Part 1. The afternoon sun hung low over the familiar streets of Rosario, bathing the buildings in a golden glow that felt almost nostalgic. Lionel Messi adjusted the brim of his cap and stepped out of a modest corner cafe, grateful for the rare anonymity the quiet weekday offered him. No roaring crowds, no flashing cameras, just the soft murmur of traffic and the distant echo of children playing football in a nearby alley. He had come back to this neighborhood for reasons he couldn't fully explain. Perhaps it was exhaustion from the constant spotlight. Perhaps it was the need to reconnect with the boy he used to be, the small, shy kid who once walked these cracked sidewalks with oversized dreams and scuffed sneakers. The air carried the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. He paused, letting memory wash over him. He could almost see his younger self running late for school, backpack bouncing against his shoulders, a worn football tucked under his arm. And then, across the street, something made him stop. Near the old bus stop, on a wooden bench whose paint had long since peeled away, sat an elderly woman. Her coat was thin, far too thin for the sharp breeze rolling in from the river. She held a small, faded handbag tightly in her lap, as if it contained everything she owned. Her posture, however, was unmistakable, upright, dignified, disciplined. There was something painfully familiar about the way she tilted her head slightly when observing the world, as though analyzing it rather than simply watching it. His heart skipped. No, it couldn't be. He stepped closer, each movement slower than the last, as recognition began to take shape. "Señora Martinez?" he asked gently. The woman looked up. Her eyes were tired but intelligent, the kind that once commanded silence in a classroom full of restless children. For a moment, confusion clouded her expression. Then it cleared, replaced by astonishment. "Lionel," she whispered. The sound of his name in her voice transported him back decades. She had been his literature teacher when he was 10 years old. Back then, he was smaller than most of his classmates, quieter too. While other boys boasted about goals scored in the schoolyard, he preferred sitting near the window, tracing patterns in his notebook. Reading aloud had terrified him. He remembered the first time she had called on him. His hands trembled so badly the page shook. Snickers echoed from the back of the classroom. He wished the floor would swallow him whole. But she hadn't laughed. Instead, she had walked slowly to his desk, placed a gentle hand on the book, and said, "Take your time, Lionel. Your voice deserves to be heard." It was the first time anyone had said that to him. Now, standing before her decades later, he felt that same mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. "What are you doing here?" he asked softly, sitting beside her without hesitation. She offered a small smile. "Waiting. For the bus. For life to figure itself out," she replied lightly, though her eyes betrayed the heaviness beneath her words. They spoke cautiously at first, as if unsure whether the present could coexist with the past. She asked about his family. About football. About whether he still wrote stories in the margins of his notebooks. He laughed gently. "Not as much as I should." "And your mother?" she asked. "She's well," he said. "She still tells me to dress warmer." "That's good," she nodded. "Mothers should never stop worrying." There was a pause. A long one. The breeze picked up, and he noticed her coat again. Too thin. Frayed at the cuffs. Her shoes were clean but worn, the soles slightly uneven. "Señora, are you all right?" he asked carefully. She hesitated. The pride of a lifelong teacher flickered across her face. She straightened slightly, as though preparing to give a lecture. "Oh, I'm fine," she said. "Just a temporary inconvenience." He waited. Silence, he had learned over the years, often revealed more than questions. "My husband passed away last year," she admitted finally. "Heart condition. It was sudden." "I'm so sorry," he murmured. She nodded. "We had some savings. But hospitals are expensive, medicines even more so. And after he was gone, the rent increased. The building was sold. New owners." She gave a small shrug. "They wanted renovations." "And you?" he asked quietly. "I packed my things. Bring extra sandwiches for students who forgot their lunch." The woman who once spent her own salary to buy novels so her class could read together. The woman who wrote encouraging notes in red ink on his homework. "You are small, but your spirit is not." He remembered that sentence vividly. He had been struggling, not just in class, but with his health. Growth hormone treatments, doctor visits, whispers from other parents who doubted he'd ever make it. She had looked him in the eye and said, "Lionel, the world measures height in centimeters. I measure it in courage." And now she was sitting on a public bench with nowhere permanent to go. Where are you staying? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. A community shelter for a few nights, she said quickly. They are very kind. It's only temporary. I'm on a waiting list for housing assistance. Temporary. The word echoed. Around them, life continued indifferently. Cars passed. A group of teenagers laughed loudly, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding just a few meters away. He studied her hands, still graceful, still expressive. Those hands once held chalk and shaped young minds. Those hands once corrected his essays with patience and care. Do you remember, he said slowly, the story you made us read about the boy who thought he was invisible? Her eyes lit up faintly. Yes, he learned he wasn't invisible. He just hadn't found his stage yet. You told me that day, he said, swallowing emotion, that sometimes the quietest person carries the loudest dreams. She smiled. And you proved me right. He shook his head. No, you did. You believed in me before anyone else did. Her gaze softened. For a moment, neither spoke. The years between them seemed to dissolve, leaving only teacher and student, two souls connected by something deeper than circumstance. A gust of wind cut through the street, and she shivered almost imperceptibly. That was when he truly saw it, not just her situation, but the injustice of it. The world cheered his goals. Stadiums erupted at his name. Children wore jerseys with his number printed boldly across their backs. Yet the woman who had once nurtured his confidence sat unnoticed on a weathered bench, battling quiet hardship with dignity. Senora, he began carefully, why didn't you tell anyone? Your former students, she interrupted gently. They have their lives, their struggles. I taught them to stand on their own feet, not to look back at an old woman. You're not just an old woman, he said firmly. She laughed softly. To the world, I am. To me, he replied, you're the reason I learned to speak without fear. Her eyes shimmered slightly, but she blinked the tears away. I'm proud of you, Lionel, she said. Not because of trophies, but because you never forgot where you came from. The words struck him deeply. Had he forgotten? He built hospitals, donated quietly, supported foundations. But somehow, in all the grand gestures, he had missed the simplest one, looking closely at the people who once stood behind him. A bus approached, brakes screeching. She rose slowly, gripping her handbag. Where does this one take you? He asked. Just a few blocks, she said. Closer to the shelter. The word again. He stood too. May I walk you? She hesitated, then nodded. They walked side by side, past graffiti-covered walls and familiar storefronts. Children kicked a ball nearby, and instinctively, he smiled at the rhythm of their play. Still the same, she remarked. Always, he agreed. As they reached the modest building she indicated, his chest tightened. It was clean but plainly temporary, a place people passed through, not a place they called home. She turned to him. Thank you for stopping, she said. It means more than you know. He wanted to say 1,000 things. To promise solutions. To fix everything instantly. But instead, he simply said, I'll see you tomorrow. She looked surprised. You don't have to. I want to. For the first time, her composure cracked slightly. You always were stubborn. He grinned faintly. You taught me that. As she disappeared inside the building, he remained on the sidewalk long after the door closed. The sky had darkened, the golden hue replaced by deepening blue. He thought of stadium lights. Of roaring fans. Of medals and headlines. None of them had ever made his heart ache the way this quiet encounter had. Because greatness, he realized, was not just about how high you rise. It was about who you lift when you remember where you started. And standing there in the fading light of his childhood neighborhood, he understood that this moment, this unexpected reunion, was about to change something far greater than a scoreboard. Part 2. That night, sleep refused to come. Lionel Messi lay awake in the quiet of his home, staring at the ceiling while the city outside slowly dimmed into silence. The image of Senora Martinez sitting alone on that weathered bench replayed again and again in his mind. He had faced roaring stadiums, crushing defeats, and the relentless pressure of global expectations. He had learned to steady his heartbeat before penalty kicks watched by millions. But nothing had unsettled him like the quiet dignity in his former teacher's eyes when she said, "It's only temporary." Temporary. He knew what temporary felt like. As a child, the hormone treatments were supposed to be temporary. The financial strain on his family, temporary. The uncertainty about his future, temporary. But temporary struggles can feel endless when you are inside them. He turned onto his side and reached for his phone. There were messages from teammates, sponsors, media contacts. Invitations. Congratulations. Headlines discussing his latest performance. None of them mattered at that moment. Instead, he opened his contacts and called his longtime advisor. "I need you to find something for me," he said quietly when the groggy voice answered. "Of course. What is it?" "A small apartment, close to my old neighborhood. Safe, comfortable, quiet." He paused, and discreet. There was a brief silence on the other end. "For you?" "No," he replied. "For someone who once made sure I didn't give up." The next morning, he returned to the community shelter before the sun had fully risen. He wore simple clothes again, no entourage, no security detail hovering nearby. He found her in the common room, seated at a table with 3 children gathered around her. She was reading aloud from a worn paperback novel, her voice steady and expressive. The children listened as though the walls around them had dissolved and the world of the story had replaced their reality. For a moment, he didn't interrupt. That was who she was. Even with almost nothing, she was still giving. When the story ended and the children scattered for breakfast, she looked up and saw him. "You came back," she said, surprised. "I said I would." She smiled faintly. "Famous people usually don't keep small promises." "I learned from someone who did," he replied. They stepped outside to talk. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of a waking city. "I've been thinking," he began carefully. "You once told me that success means remembering who helped you climb." She studied him. "Yes. Then allow me to remember." Her posture stiffened slightly. "Lionel, it's not charity," he said gently, anticipating her resistance. "It's gratitude. And it's long overdue." She looked away, pride and vulnerability battling across her face. "I spent my life teaching children to stand on their own," she said. "If I accept help, what does that say?" "That you taught them well enough for one of them to return," he answered. The words hung between them. He handed her a simple envelope. Inside was a key. She frowned in confusion. "What is this?" "A place where you won't need to wait for buses unless you want to." Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out a small card with an address printed neatly on it. It was only a few blocks from the school where she had taught for over 30 years. "I can't," she began. "You can," he interrupted softly. "You always told us to accept opportunities when they knock. Consider this, a knock." Tears welled in her eyes despite her effort to remain composed. "You shouldn't have," she whispered. "Yes," he said quietly, "I should have done it sooner." When she first stepped into the apartment later that week, she stood frozen in the doorway. It wasn't extravagant, it wasn't a mansion or anything that screamed wealth. But it was warm, sunlight filtered through clean windows. Shelves stood ready for books. A small balcony overlooked the same streets where she had once walked to school. On the dining table lay a framed photograph of her old classroom, carefully restored from an archived school image. At the back of the frame was a handwritten note. To the teacher who made a quiet boy believe his voice mattered. She pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. Behind her, he stood quietly, allowing her to absorb the moment. "I also spoke to the school principal," he added after a while. She turned. "Why?" "There's an unused classroom. They're renovating it. And they agreed to open a weekly literary workshop. Free tutoring for children who need extra help." He smiled gently. "It will carry your name." Her composure finally broke. "I'm retired," she said through tears. "You're not finished," he replied. Weeks passed, and something remarkable began to happen. Every Saturday morning, children from the neighborhood gathered in the newly restored classroom. Some struggled with reading, some with writing, some simply needed a quiet place to be heard. At the door, a modest plaque read, "Aula Martinez, because every voice deserves to be heard." She stood at the front of the room again, chalk in hand, eyes bright with purpose. The same steady patience, the same belief. Messi visited once, quietly, sitting in the back corner. He watched as she encouraged a timid girl to read aloud. "Take your time," she said gently. "Your voice deserves to be heard." The words echoed through him like a familiar melody. After the session ended and the children left, she approached him. "You see," she said softly, "you didn't just give me a home." He shook his head. "You built this. I only opened a door." News of his involvement eventually surfaced, as such things often do. Headlines praised his generosity. Social media flooded with admiration. But he avoided interviews about it. When a reporter finally asked him during a press conference why he had done it, he paused thoughtfully before answering. "There was a teacher who once told me I wasn't invisible," he said simply. "I just returned the lesson. That was all." One quiet evening months later, he visited her apartment again. They sat on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Do you regret anything?" she asked suddenly. "In football," he replied lightly. "In life," he thought for a moment. "Sometimes I regret not noticing sooner," he admitted. "I built foundations far away, but I didn't see what was happening right here." She nodded slowly. Success moves quickly. Gratitude moves quietly. He looked at her, absorbing the wisdom that still flowed effortlessly from her. "You know," she said with a small smile, "when you were 10, you wrote an essay about what you wanted to become." He laughed. "A football player. Yes. But at the end, you added something." She looked at him knowingly. "You wrote, 'I want to make people proud of believing in me.'" He felt his throat tighten. "I think," she continued gently, "you've done that." He exhaled slowly. Trophies filled cabinets. Records decorated history books. Crowds chanted his name in cities across the world. But sitting there, listening to the woman who once steadied his trembling hands over a book, he felt a different kind of victory. Quieter, deeper, permanent, because goals fade from memory. Championships are eventually surpassed. Applause dissolves into silence. But the circle of kindness, teacher to student, student back to teacher, creates something far more enduring than fame. As he stood to leave that night, she stopped him. "Lionel," she said softly. "Yes, you were never small," he smiled, "and you were never invisible." The city lights flickered on below them as he walked down the familiar street once more, not as a global icon, not as a legend of the game, but as a grateful student who had finally understood that the greatest assist of his life wasn't on a football field. It was the simple act of remembering who passed him the first ball of belief.